Hello, today we will be talking with Professor Loretta Lees, the current faculty director of the Initiative on Cities at Boston University. Professor Lees is an urban geographer and urbanist who is internationally known for her research on gentrification and urban regeneration. We are so excited to be speaking with you today, Professor, and discussing certain aspects of two of your books, Gentrification, one of the first textbooks on gentrification, and Planetary Gentrification. Let's start off by asking, what was your inspiration to become an expert in gentrification? Do you have a personal connection to the subject matter?
Yes, so when I was an undergraduate student in the UK, as part of your geography degree, you have to do a dissertation, a project, a piece of primary research. So I headed off to New York City to do mine on the Lower East Side. And it was the summer of 1988, which was the summer of the anti-gentrification riots in Tompkins Square Park. So I think I had a kind of birthing of fire kind of thing in terms of gentrification. And at the time, one of my professors at my own university had hooked me up with Neil Smith, who was then at Columbia and about to move, I think, to Rutgers. And I met him and he kind of took me around Harlem and he showed me some of the kind of emerging gentrification in the 80s, in the late 80s in Harlem. He then took me to the Lower East Side. We walked all around there and basically I didn't become involved in, but I did watch what was going on. Obviously, I couldn't become involved because I wasn't part and parcel of the local community, but I know that he was quite involved in some of the kind of anti-gentrification activity that was going on, and he kind of explained the situation. So that's how I became involved, but I think it goes back further than that. So I got really interested in kind of urban geography, urban sociology, urban anthropology at university, particularly social justice issues, um, particularly around segregation, just kind of issues around urban change that had affected, lower social income groups and kind of stuff like that. So there's a whole variety of reasons why I got into gentrification.
That's really interesting that it was an inspiration that you saw it in New York and then it
Yeah,
inspired this
in
whole
the raw.
sequence of
Yeah,
events.
yeah.
So moving on to the textbook Gentrification, you, Tom Slater, and Elvin Wiley wrote the book and condensed a magnitude of information into one textbook. How did you and your colleagues determine which topics of gentrification to focus on and how to progress throughout the book in order to make it digestible?
I mean, it was interesting. So Tom Slater was my very first PhD student when I started out as an academic. Elvin Wiley, I was at UBC, but he started at University of British Columbia after I'd left. But I met him at the first big international conference on gentrification in Glasgow. So I guess the three of us started talking about how we could kind of come together and write something that was a textbook, but was a monograph, but actually also was more than that. It was something we wanted to talk beyond academia to, anti-gentrification activists like yourselves. So I guess that what we kind of thought about was, what was the early days of gentrification? And I think the beginning of the book's very much based out of my PhD that I did. I did a PhD comparing gentrification in London and New York City. So I kind of drew on that, but then tried to think forwards and outside of London and New York as well, which kind of drew Elvin and Tom in. And thinking about what were new types or new examples of gentrification that had emerged since I did my PhD and how they'd mutated over time, what that meant for the term gentrification and the politics of it. Were there too many different types of gentrification now that we're just exhausting this term or overburdening it? And it was, looking back on it now, 2008, it's a very Anglo-American or Euro-American book. Since, of course, the whole decolonization of geography and sociology and urban studies has really taken off. But at that time, that wasn't really something people were thinking about. They were still thinking that gentrification was a very North American and European process.
Just as a follow-up, do you have any advice on how we or other groups that are interested in spreading awareness about gentrification, say in a smaller neighborhood like Washington Heights, can present gentrification both on our website and conversation to get more people involved and have it be comprehensive but still educational?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complex question. It's very contextual, and it'll be very contextual to your neighborhood, who lives in it, the way that people would like to take on board that information. But I think the good thing now is there's both a humongous and growing literature on resistance to gentrification, academic literature that's started to look at different strategies, different tactics in different neighborhoods, in different cities, and different neighborhoods in terms of some of the kind of intersectionality around race, ethnicity, gender, class, age, different kinds of immigrant groups, for example, all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot to draw on. But I think that there's also some really amazing anti-gentrification kind of websites out there from different cities. So, for example, I moved from London 2 months ago, and there's an amazing website by a group called Southwark Archive Group, which is their nickname is SNAG. And they've been really fighting back against the gentrification of Southwark, which is a borough in London, particularly around the demolition of public housing, but actually more broadly. And I think it's a website that's worth looking at because it includes a mixture of academic work, media work, mini documentaries, lots of kind of pushing back against lies and against misinformation. And I think one of the big things for you in the US is about pushing back against misinformation, and particularly misinformation about gentrification as a positive process that will do good things for your neighborhood, when the reality is, from the bulk of gentrification studies work, that the negative aspects, the negative impacts completely outweigh positive impacts, particularly for a local community.
There's definitely so much misinformation and there's so much rebranding on gentrification here in a way where it's presented to be urban renewal and anything positive, but in reality, it's just not.
And I think the rhetoric is really important, and that's one of the things that SNAG does. So you've just pointed out urban renewal, urban renaissance, urban regeneration, all of these very positive terms that have this kind of vibe about them.
Mm-hmm.
And, the reality of many of those programs is gentrification.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a very
which is displacement of low-income groups. So, so one of the things that certainly in your own community you need to do is kind of expose some of that language.
Mm-hmm.
And SNAG do it in a really interesting way, in a really educational way. They make little cartoons. They've had graphic designers in who do little mini kind of podcasts, all sorts of stuff that make it easy to explain, but in a non-patronizing way.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So kind of following up on this idea of language and terminology, in your book, you discuss the evolving definition of gentrification and how we have from classical to rural, then to new build, and then finally to super gentrification. Could you briefly differentiate between each of these terms and then how they each relate to a new phase of gentrification? And overall, why is the term gentrification still the correct term to describe this process if it has undergone so many phases and changes over time?
As I said earlier, one of the reasons I wanted to write the gentrification text in 2008 was about trying to explain the mutation of this term over time. So the kind of classical notion of gentrification goes back to the kind of post-war era in American and British and European cities, where pioneer gentrifiers kind of move into an area, start to renovate old properties, old brownstones, for example, in New York City, and that there's a kind of gradual kind of takeover of the neighborhood, that property values increase and it displaces a traditional long-standing working class, if working class is the right term, low-income groups, often immigrant groups. Now, that term obviously is very kind of post-war 1960s, 1970s. The process of gentrification moved on. So as the process itself began to be kind of branded as the kind of savior for kind of post-industrial cities, then developers began to take it on board. So we got the emergence of new build gentrification. But that kind of traditional notion of classic gentrification was all about renovating historic properties. So a new build property would not be perceived to be gentrification. But in the work that I did with another ex-PhD student of mine, Mark Davidson, who now works at Clark University, not far from me, we set out to prove that actually these new build developments were also a form of gentrification because they were displacing working class, low income populations. But sometimes that displacement was done differently because some of them were built on brownfield sites where there was no pre-existing population. But the impacts would ripple, they'd have exclusionary effects in nearby neighbourhoods. So that's, we kind of set out to prove, and I think we have proven that now. Now there's a whole proliferation of work on new build gentrification all over the world. Rural gentrification is different again. So my ex-colleague at Leicester University, which I've just left, Martin Phillips, he's been kind of long arguing that, you know, rural gentrification is always seen as kind of this minority in comparison to urban gentrification. And, you know, for a long time, he's right. So we've seen now that actually with the kind of breakdown of the urban and the rural, that actually it's become increasingly difficult to, those traditional terms of what urban and rural means in the context of urbanisation and planetary urbanisation have broken down. So in many ways, I think that whole debate about rural gentrification, gentrifiers moving into rural communities, renovating properties, displacing people, pushing property prices up, is becoming even more important. Super gentrification was a bit different. I did a project in the early 2000s funded by the British Academy in Brooklyn Heights in New York City. And it became very evident to me that this was a neighborhood that wasn't just in this kind of state of mature gentrification. It had matured since the 1930s. I mean, gentrifiers started moving in there before even the war. So it really, you can kind of trace back gentrification in Brooklyn Heights to the 1930s when kind of artists and writers and kind of left liberal types moved in. But what became apparent to me is that it wasn't like gentrification was reaching this end state where it matured in the neighborhood, like all the stage models were arguing. But actually, this neighborhood was regentrifying with this new kind of super wealthy elite type of what I called a financifier, who, you know, was really kind of making lots of money in Manhattan off the back of financial industries, the deregulation of the legal industries, you know, so super wealthy people who were already looking at what they perceived to be a fully gentrified elite neighborhood, but they were doing it differently. So they would go in, buy up properties, and unlike the original gentrifiers who were very conscious of historic preservation and retaining period features, rip these properties apart, you know, clear out the historic features and put in, you know, high-end technology and marble bathrooms and all sorts of stuff. So it was also culturally a very different take on what they were doing to the neighborhood. And of course, what's happened subsequently is that, and actually I'm hoping to go back to Brooklyn Heights as now I've moved back to the States and actually do some more work on this 20 years later to see what's happened. But this now is going to be complicated by the fact that, you know, places like New York City and London and Vancouver and San Francisco, etc., have experienced what I've called kind of hyper-gentrification. It's this like frenzied, and this was kind of pre-COVID. How it's going to play out post-COVID, we don't quite yet know. But this kind of new level of frenzied kind of gentrification where the whole city is being pressured. You know, so for you guys in your neighborhood, that's going to be that kind of rounded kind of energy of hypergentrification is kind of, you know, what's going to be one of the big pressures.
In your opinion, would you say gentrification is still the correct umbrella term to classify all of them?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the big debates that's ongoing. So even in the late 90s, there were academics who were arguing that gentrification should, quote, collapse under the burden of its terms and, you know, mutations. But I've always been very, very clear from doing anti-gentrification work around the world that the term gentrification is a brand. It has a politics to it. When you vocalize gentrification in anti-gentrification activism, it still has a cachet in terms of fighting back, in terms of kind of putting in people's mind that this is very much a social justice issue. It's a right to the city issue. But, you know, people have started banding around other terms. So, for example, in London, lots of people now have been saying, well, actually, gentrification is not a good term. Social cleansing is a better term. Other people have said ethnic cleansing is a better term. But gentrification, in my mind, is about that. And it's always been about social cleansing. It's been about ethnic cleansing. There's also debates, for example, in Brazil, there's been a lot of pushback saying that, and this will get into your conversation later about planetary gentrification, that actually gentrification is a very British term. It's an Anglo-American term. I mean, it's a British term, so this is a term that was developed by a British sociologist called Ruth Glass in the mid-1960s in London. So some people are saying, well, it's a fossil of that time. It should be 1960s London. We shouldn't be using it anymore. We should be looking at new terms for a new periodization, and actually for different cities and different countries around the world. So in Brazil, for example, there's been big pushback against, both from activists, or actually less from activists, but definitely from academics, for using the term in anti-gentrification activities, because they're saying we should have a more indigenous, organic term that's from Brazil and that's been, made in Brazil. But interestingly, in Brazil, the academics are very kind of pushing back, but the activists themselves on the ground have been using the term, and to good value.
Going back to our earlier conversation on misinformation and the rebranding of the term here in the United States, especially, there is a lot of people that argue for the positive aspects of gentrification, whether it be that it brings in new business, it makes the neighborhood safer, any of those that everyone always talks about. So when trying to discuss the positive versus the negative points of gentrification, how can one assess who the neighborhood is for and who benefits from the positive and the negative aspects? And is it possible to discuss these positive and negative outcomes with regard for everyone involved rather than just one specific group?
Yeah, it's very complicated, and as I said, it's contextual to the neighborhood. So you need a really grounded experience of who's in that neighborhood, who's going to be impacted, how they're going to be impacted differently. And then in a neighborhood, of course, there's different kinds of gentrifications. There's residential gentrification that's affecting people's homes and properties. And then there's commercial gentrification, which is affecting people's businesses. So I've spent the last 2 days in a big conference looking at displacement due to gentrification in small businesses across the United States. And that's been really, really interesting, looking at the different pressures, particularly on immigrant-owned and BIPOC businesses, and thinking about strategies to kind of stay put in the face of that. But I think it's very tricky. So, I mean, there has been work done academically by, I think Roland Atkinson did some work where he developed a table on the positive and negatives and trying to weigh up the positive and negatives in gentrification. But it's really difficult, and those positives and negatives change over time. And of course, a city wants to increase its tax base, and gentrification does theoretically bring in money and increase the tax base. But in doing that, it has these massively negative impacts because it pushes people out who've lived there perhaps for a long period of time, or people nearby who are unable to move in, whether it be friends, family, people who, traditionally would have liked to have lived in that neighborhood. So it's quite complicated, but I do think it is useful to put a list of positives against a list of negatives, because the negatives are longer, but also the positives are often misinformation, if that makes sense. And there's often no proof of the positives. So for example, when city officials say, yeah, this is going to improve your tax base, often there's no then research done or evidence to what does that actually translate as. So, for example, the stuff I've done in London around commercial gentrification, long-standing small businesses get pushed out and new businesses moved in. So, yeah, those new businesses get to kind of make money. But how do you then weigh up the fact these other long-standing, often immigrant-owned or BIPOC businesses have been pushed out?
So in our specific neighborhood in Washington Heights, what we see is that the Dominican culture and the Dominican presence is being pushed out because many of them are not landowners. They've been renting there for generations and generations. But now, especially with the New York rising prices and everything, they find that the landowners have to increase rent. And so that is pushing out many of the populations that have been there for generations. Is there any policy or maybe assessment that can support our argument for the preservation of the Dominican population there, regardless of their land ownership?
I mean, that's probably your most difficult question. And that question of ownership, and it was really interesting. So in the conference I've been in the last 2 days, lots of minority business owners were arguing, that it's ownership that we need here, that people need to own their business, own their property that the business is in, own their home, their residence, to protect them against gentrification. But that's not always the case. So, often, people can be removed or displaced through eminent domain or compulsory purchase order, as it's known in the UK. So ownership alone doesn't always protect you. In my mind, the biggest protection is actually to try and remove properties, whether it's your home or your business, out of the market. So, in the gentrification book and in the work I've done since, we promote, for example, community land trusts as one model. It's not the only model, but it's one model that takes property, whether it's commercial or residential, out of the market. So it's not threatened by that kind of economic push with rent hikes and other stuff. That people in that community then make decisions about the rents that they set. They make decisions about how you pass on property and about ownership and other stuff. There's no specific set of policies in place at the moment, but this is something I want to do some work on in the US. I mean, there have been different examples across the US of kind of anti-gentrification policy making at city levels, but they've tended to be more like, we will give money back to people who've been displaced. So it's almost like they're displaced, but then give them some money, hoping that that will somehow be this ethical, we've kind of done something, which I think is problematic. I think there's increasing work now done on heritage around race and ethnicity in the US, looking at how you can utilize heritage to fight back against gentrification and kind of stay put. And I think, in my mind, in terms of the Dominican community, that's probably somewhere to look. It's different for different groups. So I had a PhD student looking at Black preservation in Florida, looking at a neighborhood that tried to preserve itself by selling African-American kind of historic preservation for a long time, Black neighborhood, trying to stop gentrification. And then you get these complexities of where the city comes in and tries to help, but then doesn't help and actually messes it all up. So it's quite complex, but I think it's worth looking for you guys at some of these other cases elsewhere, what has worked, what hasn't worked, but looking at heritage around preserving ethnic heritage, for want of a better term.
I believe that it's incredibly important to realize the globality of this issue that people tend to ignore and beyond Western cases. In your studies, what are some outstanding similarities that stood out to you that you have noticed between, for example, New York and Rio, or Shanghai or Mumbai?
And we kind of talk about that in the book. So I guess, at the end of the day, I'm, I guess, a critical political economist who's also very taken by post-colonial theory. So we set out in this book to do something a bit problematic, which is kind of wed critical political economy with post-colonial theory, which, as you know, can be quite difficult. But I think we certainly got debate going, and the whole planetary gentrification thing has begun to kind of take off, and the discussions now are becoming really important. The key similarities at the end of the day are global capitalism links us all around the world, no matter how we try and escape it. It's there. Global financialization, the way that cities and neighborhoods have become places of investment instead of, for example, traditionally, countries and cities would invest in industry or individuals would invest in industry. Now people think it's safer and less risky to invest in property. And it's one of the reasons why property, both commercial and residential, has just become massively financialized. And that is one of the things that kind of twins this together. The other thing that kind of is very notable is the way that the state, and by the state, I mean both national policy, but also city-based policy, has become increasingly involved in promoting gentrification as a way to remake cities, but remake them for middle class or increasingly upper middle class groups, because even the middle classes can barely afford to live in many gentrifying cities anymore. And as part of that, there's been some really interesting similarities between kind of authoritarian practices. So if you look at New York City, the kind of zero tolerance initiatives, the kind of broken windows theory that was used to clean up neighborhoods as a precursor to gentrification, is very similar to what was going on in Sao Paulo. the way that they tried to kind of crack down on drug barons and people in the kind of slums that they were hoping to kind of clean up as a precursor to gentrification there. And again, these kind of authoritarian practices in South Korea and places like that. So I think there are lots of similarities, but at the same time, there are also distinctive differences. And, you know, each country, each city, and in fact, even neighborhoods on the ground are quite different. And so the kind of gentrification that emerges has a lot of endogenous characteristics to what's going on there, you know. And the other important thing is that a lot of people had kind of put to one side is time. So one thing we were very clear about in that Planetary Gentrification book is that gentrification has not just gone global. So, for example, in 2002, I think it was, Neil Smith suddenly proclaimed gentrification has gone global, suddenly gone all around the world. But actually, gentrification had been global for a long time before that. It's just that it had happened in other cities around the world without the name, if that makes sense. So there's now a lot of work trying to trace earlier forms of gentrification that didn't have the name because the name wasn't, you know, coined until 1964. So I think we do need to be looking back in time, but also forward in time. So we need to be looking at different spaces and different times as well. And I guess the other thing that's really important is if you're going to talk about heritage in your neighbourhood, you also have to remember that heritage has been organic, it's changed over time, and it will change yet again. So you don't want to be selling some kind of static notion of heritage either. You know, what it means to be Dominican in New York City will have changed over time. You know, so getting a sense of that change, what it might mean to young people versus older people is really, really important as well.
I think you also briefly touched on this term slum gentrification, but could you elaborate more on what that concept means and how it contrasts and compares to the situation in larger cities such as New York?
I mean, one of the reasons there's two reasons why I got into that. So when I was working on the Planetary Gentrification book with Humbang Shin and Ernesto Lopez Morales, I was also doing a big research project in London looking at the demolition of public housing estates and their gentrification. And what was really notable for me is how in the run-up to those demolitions, they had been branded slums. So here we have these slums in the centre of, you know, a big global city like London where, you know, you don't think about slums in that way. But then at the same time, I was doing the planetary gentrification stuff and looking at some of the work that had been done on slum gentrification in, for example, South Africa. People were starting to talk about the gentrification of slums in Brazil and places like that. And I was very interested in how we had this global north slum and this global south slum. And what did it actually mean? What was slum gentrification and how did it play out? And you know, there's kickback by certain academics even today who said that who have said that there's no such thing as slum gentrification in the global south. These are informal settlements. Because they're informal settlements, they cannot be an example of gentrification, which of course is just bizarre because even an informal settlement, even a slum, is massively connected to global capitalism through technology, social media, through different kinds of ownerships of properties in these slums that go over time, but might just be a different form of ownership to what we think of when we think of traditional ownership in New York or London. So in my mind, it was a very interesting kind of set of stuff to get my head around, to really kind of think through. And, you know, if you look now at Mumbai, there's been lots of kind of media coverage now internationally of the gentrification of slums in and around the centre of Mumbai. Some people have talked about greenwashing. So, you know, the slums have been gotten rid of as unhygienic. And in their place, we've got these new middle-class, new build bourgeois settlements that are sold as these green, sustainable developments. Yet, ironically, the slums themselves were probably much more carbon zero or much more green and sustainable than these new build developments that have replaced them. So again, it's the kind of rhetoric. And now increasingly, of course, it's the greening agenda that's being used to sell and brand gentrification, particularly to people of your age, because, you know, we've got this new climate active generation who, you know, are going to be massively impacted by climate change. So, you know, you look around now and it's the kind of greenwashing, and it's done in different ways. It's done as a, you know, we're greening this environment. This is a really kind of concrete jungle. We're going to replace it. But it's also being done in a kind of financialization that goes with it as being greened as well. So, you know, some companies arguing we're only using money that's been put in ethical green investments like renewable energy. So there's a whole complex set of rhetoric now around it that's trying to sell this gentrification as this really positive, climate active kind of, you know, thing. I'll give you an example in London. So I did work on in Southwark in central London. There was a big council estate, a big public housing project called the Heygate estate. They demolished it, they displaced 3,500 people, so a significant number of people. They built a new build development on it, which was called Elephant Park. It was promoted in East Asia before it was even built. It was being sold off plan to East Asian investors. They have claimed that this is one of the most sustainable developments in London. So it's got all of these banners, and you know, this is the greenest place in London. But you know, if you actually look at what's happened, the carbon counting from demolishing the estate that was there initially is massive. There were hundreds of mature plane trees. They chopped most of them down. You know, if you count in other environmental things like bird life, like wildlife, that was all damaged. So actually how you weigh up and count the environmental costs is really quite complicated. You know, and then they kind of sell these new developments as carbon neutral. We're going to have, you know, we're going to have carbon neutral heating systems and other stuff. But actually, when it comes to building them, they often renege on that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I'll give you another example. So the Strata Tower in Southwark, which Bill Clinton was invited over to kind of open in this kind of big inauguration. At the time, some of the tenants from the Heygate estate were told they could move into that, although this is a new, massive, high-rise, new build tower near to where the Heygate estate was. The bottom 10 floors were housing associations, so affordable housing, and all the rest is private. There's separate lifts for the public housing tenants and the private tenants, so they never actually mix. It was argued to be the most sustainable building in London. It had this massive wind turbine on the roof, but that wind turbine has never worked. So, you know, so you have all these bizarre scenarios. And of course, nobody's ever come back and said, look, you got this through planning, arguing this is going to be massively sustainable. The wind turbine's never turned on. It's never used. It was too noisy. So the tenants, the people underneath couldn't sleep because it just, the technology didn't work. So there's all of these cases where all these promises are made, but they're reneged on, but then nobody ever comes back and says, look, you reneged on this.
That was so similar to one of the concepts brought up in New York, which is, it's not in terms of sustainability, but it's in terms of affordability, where they say that they're going to include affordable housing in like certain sectors of the new buildings. And then this idea of affordability can be argued because affordability for someone who is lower to middle class, who has been living there, is very different from someone who is a new resident. So it's also this idea of defining sustainability or defining affordability. It's just so different, and it doesn't.
I mean, defining affordability is really key. So, for example, the last 2 years I've been I was chair of the London Housing Panel, working with community groups with the Mayor of London and debating housing policies and practices. And one of the key things that we were doing was trying to say, look, you just constantly brand this term affordable housing. But actually, if you break it down and look at it, the only truly affordable housing is public housing, or what you guys call public housing projects, or what we call council housing in the UK. And that there's all these categories of affordability. And actually, if you look at it, you know, barely middle income groups can barely afford what is supposedly affordable, let alone low income groups or really marginalized groups. So one of the kind of misinformations is around affordability, and that's certainly something you guys should look at in your neighborhood. And one of the reasons they've been able to do this, of course, is because the whole mixed income communities agenda and policy making in the US, which got copied in the UK as social mix policy, the argument being that we're going to desegregate these big segregated low income neighborhoods. It's for their good. We're going to bring in middle class people, their education, everything will trickle down, and they'll get wealthier, they'll experience social mobility, educational mobility. But the reality is that even if they get back even if the low-income groups get to move back into those communities, which invariably they don't, there's segregation. They don't actually mix. The two groups of people don't mix. And the strata tower that I just talked about is a nice example of that, because it's actually built into the fabric. They have separate lifts. They can't even mix, even if they wanted to.
Another thing that we deal with a lot and we talk about a lot is how do we approach the dilemma of being students at Columbia, which is one of the largest agents of gentrification in New York, and not playing into the immorality of talking about the issue and thinking that, we're solving the problem, but being part of the problem.
I mean, there's a whole literature now on the impact of universities, and actually particularly Columbia, on adjacent neighborhoods and gentrification, but that's been ongoing for quite some time. I mean, there's two things. One is to stand up to your own institution and, group together, push back, try to get people at Columbia to work with people who know what they're talking about around gentrification and trying to stop it and trying to mediate the impacts of what they've already done. It might be taking money from Columbia's quaffers, which are quite large, and helping with properly affordable housing for low-income groups in adjacent neighborhoods. There's different ways of doing it. But I think as students, you will get listened to. And I think it just takes a bit of punch to kind of stand up to your own institution in a way, but not in a deliberately negative or provocative way, but in a way that they think that you can work with them, I think. So there's kind of different ways of doing it politically, if that makes sense. But the climate thing's interesting because, one of the things that's taking off now is, and it's almost going back to the kind of Jane Jacobs, standing up in front of the bulldozers in New York City in the 1960s and trying to stop the demolition of whole swathes of New York City and kind of, new build highways. That's beginning to re-emerge as an agenda. So one of the things that people who are fighting climate change are arguing is that we should be preserving and we shouldn't be knocking down, we shouldn't be demolishing. So that might be something to think about in terms of kind of climate activism and gentrification. But it does bring you back to the whole Jane Jacobs thing.
And I think it's really interesting how we kind of tied in so many different aspects of gentrification, like the climate change thing, the affordability, the financial, economic, ethnic, literally at all angles about gentrification, which is really interesting.